Well, thank you very much for having me here to talk about my remarks from yesterday. I referred to four things. The first was to talk about what CAPSARC is in the context of new institutions in Saudi Arabia. CAPSARC is an independent think tank, independently financed, with independent governance, really to allow Saudi Arabia to punch its weight in the intellectual discourse around energy on the global stage. The main features of CAPSARC are that we are both Saudi and expat, that we are men and women, that it is a meritocratic organization focused on the major energy questions for the world. Those really fall into three categories. The first is energy transition. There's a lot of good work being done on energy transitions, but the underlying model of how energy transitions occur is fairly poorly understood. There's a conventional view, which is the incumbent with inexorably rising costs and the new entrant with exponentially declining costs, and there'll be a crossover between 5 and 7 years away. The problem is that crossover always seems to be 5 or 7 years away, and it doesn't take into account the supply chain robustness, if you like, that the new entrant typically doesn't have a very robust supply chain. So as the costs become competitive, as the demand for the new entrant increases, the costs will bounce. Similarly, the incumbent will compete downwards, and so you have this downward dance of bouncing costs against each other. And that is quite poorly understood. There are time delays in the sensitivities of the supply, if you like, the costs of both supply chains. New capacity is built, but only with a lag. And so one of the things that CAPSARC is doing is trying to build a quantitative model to describe how this has worked in the past, in order to provide a test bed for policymakers to look at what is the most economically efficient way of driving an energy transition. What we know is that their poster child is often telecommunications. They talk about the speed with which mobile telecommunications have supplanted fixed lines. 40 years ago, the first mobile phone calls were made, but we're still only halfway to transitioning away from fixed line telephony. The second point I raised was about the need for an alignment between consumer preferences and policy. It's not good enough for policymakers to say, you must buy an electric car, or you must buy a fuel-efficient car, or you must buy this appliance because it meets a standard. Because in the end, policymakers can't tell people what they should want. We see this with compact fluorescent lights. Yesterday we did a little poll in the room and we found a large number of people stockpiled incandescent lights before the ban in order that they would be able to continue having the quality of light they wanted. So the policies that are most effective are those that align the consumer preference and societal aspiration with the end objective, and this is especially true in terms of energy efficiency and decarbonisation. The third area that I talked about was the problem of free riders, that it doesn't matter why we're in the situation we're in, who is responsible for the levels of carbon in the atmosphere, so much as that people in the OECD will use as justification for not making the efforts that the current system of governance requires, that there are free riders from rapidly growing economies outside the OECD. Well, this is partly because there is an element of extraterritoriality in terms of a production-based carbon governance scheme, whereas what can countries really control? It's their internal demand, that if we could have a system of energy accounting and of carbon accounting that would look at the embodied emissions, the embodied energy in the goods and services that are consumed, one could apply non-discriminatory tariffs for anything that comes into the boundary. So that the old story of outsourcing an energy-intensive industry, if I move a factory from Texas to Mexico, the world doesn't benefit, but if America looks at its energy intensity, it's been improved, even if it just re-imports all of the goods that were created. So overcoming the boundary effects by using the boundary around demand, because governments can influence policy and consumer behaviour within their own countries and use the weight of that so that then the boundary and the free rider issue cease to exist. Now I know this is one of the directions that the new IPCC work is going to examine this, and it creates a paradox, which is that if the end consumers are going to pay a tariff, whether it is on domestically produced or foreign produced goods, then the choice becomes for the original producer. Do I want the consuming government to collect that money, or should I collect that money myself? Well, that's a pretty easy decision to make. And so the paradox may be that it is only by having a consumption-based carbon governance system that we can hope to have a fully functioning and lower cost to administer production-based carbon governance system. So these were really the 3 points, and at CAPSARC we're building a research team pulling in many of the best researchers in the area of energy and economics and policy in order to research these problems in a very fact-based way, to provide transparency around the input data, the algorithms we use and the output that we produce, and inviting people really to engage in that intellectual debate. That's what's keeping me excited for the next few years.